Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into some source material that is, honestly, truly chilling. You know, when we think about the penal system, stuff like jails, prisons, holding cells, we just naturally assume that those towering concrete walls and heavy iron bars are there to keep the danger locked safely inside, right? But what happens when the very system designed to isolate those threats actually turns into a bridge? A bridge connecting everyday, normal people straight to their worst nightmares. Today, we're breaking down 3 heavily documented accounts that show exactly how the absolute darkest elements of the correctional system often reach far, far beyond its physical boundaries.
Maybe I'll see you around. I mean, out of context, it sounds like a casual, totally friendly farewell, doesn't it? But as we all know, context is literally everything. This is actually a real quote, spoken by an inmate right as he was being released, and he said it directly to a corrections officer. As we're gonna see today, that simple little sentence, it definitely wasn't a polite goodbye. It was a promise. It was this ominous, creeping guarantee that the boundaries between life inside a cell and life on the outside were about to violently collapse.
So, the big question we really have to ask ourselves here is, what actually happens when the prison walls can't protect you? Today's explainer is going to drop us straight into the incredibly unsettling reality of 3 different people whose total illusion of safety was just utterly shattered. We're going to pull apart the actual mechanics of vulnerability. We'll look at how things like forced proximity, isolation, and massive systemic flaws can take a temporary, maybe even brief encounter with a jail environment and turn it into a lifelong psychological haunting.
Okay, so our first account really exposes this terrifying gap between what we expect to happen and what actually goes down. Picture this, an 18-year-old makes an incredibly foolish decision. He tries to shoplift a phone from Walmart with some buddies. He gets caught by loss prevention, handcuffed, and hauled off to the station on a Friday night. His expectation? Well, he figures he'll get a slap on the wrist, maybe spend a super boring weekend sitting in a county jail cell until court opens up on Monday. But the reality? He is stripped of his clothes, shoved into an orange jumpsuit, and tossed into a holding area with these hardened, heavily tattooed men who are literally mocking him. But the real nightmare, the one that changes everything, begins when he's finally assigned a cellmate, a guy in his 40s who casually introduces himself as Bob.
The source material maps out this terrifying escalation in Bob's behavior. Now, at first, he actually acts like this calming, fatherly figure, just explaining the jail routine to the kid. But man, that dynamic shifts so fast. Inside the cell, Bob starts completely ignoring physical and conversational boundaries. He's sitting way too close, touching the young guy's knee, and asking these highly intrusive questions about exactly where he lives and who he lives with. The 18-year-old barely manages to survive the weekend without sleeping a single wink. But the second he gets released, the behavior just skyrockets. He gets a follow request on his public Instagram from this faceless burner account. The direct message is a selfie of Bob, and the caption just says, "Miss you already." And then, days later, the escalation hits its absolute peak. There's a ratty car parked across the street in the fog, and then someone is violently testing both the front and back doorknobs of his home.
So the kid calls 911, literally hiding inside his own house. Eventually, after actually spotting Bob later on at a local dive bar, he was wearing a baseball cap and a dark jacket, just standing there smiling at him across the room. The victim and his parents rushed to the police precinct, and they managed to get a temporary restraining order. But when they get the paperwork, it reveals this massive, terrifying plot twist. Bob wasn't even his real name. Just think about that for a second. Imagine the sheer helplessness of realizing that this predator stalking you has your real name, your social media, and your home address, but you don't even know his actual identity.
What's absolutely wild about this case is the massive systemic failure operating underneath it all. I mean, how did a random guy in a county jail cell track down an 18-year-old kid's home address and Instagram? Well, this is a textbook example of public records exploitation. See, when someone is processed into the penal system, their booking data, arrest logs, and basic info often enter these databases. And those databases can be accessed, or at least deduced, by someone who really knows how to navigate the system. The tragic flaw here is that a minor non-violent offense forced a totally naive teenager into a locked room with a seasoned predator, which essentially handed that predator the exact puzzle pieces he needed to turn the outside world into his own personal hunting ground.
Now, this whole concept of vulnerability gets even darker when the threat comes from the actual physical structure of a prison itself. Take this quote from a young woman named Laura. She said, "It's not that far after all, and if it's abandoned, nobody will be there." I mean, talk about famous last words, right? Laura and her friend were totally fascinated by this imposing, Gothic-looking building they'd spotted off the highway. Assuming the place was completely empty, they decided to do a little amateur urban exploration.
So it's 1 a.m. Laura and her friend are creeping around this massive abandoned prison. It's got these super high arching roofs and this giant eerie cross right at the peak. They walk up to the front, and incredibly, the heavy main door is just unlatched. So they step inside. The air is ridiculously thick. You've got that overwhelming, musty smell of rotting wood, and swirling dust particles are just totally caught in the beams of their flashlights. They're navigating through these crumbling old cell blocks, with all this debris just crunching under their shoes. And then, suddenly, a massive echoing crash reverberates through the pitch-black facility. They spin around, and there is a man standing just 20 feet away from them.
The man introduces himself as Mike, and when you really break down Mike's behavior here, you are watching a literal masterclass in predatory psychology unfold in 3 very specific steps. Step 1. Feign authority. Mike immediately claims to be a security guard who is hired to detain trespassers. But hold on, there is a glaring red flag right out of the gate. He's wearing jeans, white sneakers, a black sweatshirt, and an unbuttoned flannel. Not exactly a uniform, right? Step 2, establish false trust. He starts speaking in this super smooth, calming voice, promising he's not going to involve the cops because they look like, quote, nice young women. And then, step 3, isolate. Mike tells them the main exit is blocked by a cave-in, and he forces them down this narrow, completely claustrophobic hallway toward a pitch-black basement staircase. He even tries to physically guide one of the women down into the dark by grabbing her arm. Thankfully, Laura trusts her gut. She screams, shoves him away, and the 2 women just sprint blindly back through those dark cell blocks. They actually make it to the front door, which, shocker, had no cave-in blocking it whatsoever, and they escape to their car. But the true, absolute horror of this whole situation doesn't even set in until a week later. One of the women finally calls the local police to report the incident, and the police, they are absolutely speechless. Not because the girls were trespassing, but because of one terrifying fact. The prison had no security guards, no cameras, no patrols, nothing. Mike wasn't a guard at all. He was just a predator using the extreme isolation of an abandoned prison to trap unsuspecting victims. For our third and final account, we're looking at someone who actually worked inside the system. 1,000. That is the distance in miles that a corrections officer moved away from his hometown to start a totally fresh life and take a new job at a local county jail. I mean, 1,000 miles? That should be an insurmountable barrier for any ghost from your past to track you down, especially back in an era before we all had massive digital footprints. But then, this officer meets an inmate named Edgar. Edgar's locked up for a parole violation. Now, Edgar is polite, he's respectful, he always calls the officer sir. But then, Edgar starts casually dropping information that literally makes the officer's blood run cold. First, he just casually asks how his brother Stan is doing. A few days later, he asks if his mother Diana still lives out by the lake. And later on, he asks if his nephew is still a huge fan of baseball. So the absolute kicker here is that this is impossible knowledge. The officer has 0 social media, his own coworkers don't even know this stuff, and Edgar's file clearly shows he was born and raised right there, a full 1,000 miles away from the officer's hometown. It is a complete, totally unexplainable invasion of privacy. The officer obviously reports it, but his supervisor completely dismisses it. Eventually, Edgar is released, and on his way out, he drops that fateful line we talked about earlier. Maybe I'll see you around. And wow, he absolutely meant it. Months go by. Then, one morning, the officer's ring camera goes off. There's a man with his hood up, standing at the door, claiming to be a traveling meat salesman. Okay, weird. But the very next night, at 2 a.m., the doorbell rings again. It is the exact same man. The officer hits the two-way audio, announces he's law enforcement, and says he's calling it in. But the man doesn't run. Instead, he slowly lifts his head, looks dead into the camera lens, and just gives this huge, absolutely terrifying smile. It's Edgar, and he doesn't scramble into a getaway truck, he just calmly turns and walks off into the pitch-black night. A month later, a figure perfectly matching Edgar's description rings the doorbell at the officer's girlfriend's house at 10:30 p.m. So the officer goes into full panic mode. He desperately starts digging through Edgar's files, trying to figure out who this guy really is and how on earth to stop him. But his search hits a terrifying, totally brick-wall dead end. Edgar had no known family, he had no previous addresses on file, even his parole officer confirmed he wasn't actually living at his registered address. He simply vanished. Edgar literally became a ghost. For the corrections officer, this is pure psychological torture. He has absolutely no idea how Edgar extracted all that hyper-personal data, and worse, he has no idea when or if Edgar is going to strike again.
And honestly, this brings us right to the shared trauma that links all three of these accounts. The physical events might end, sure, but the psychological aftermath, that lingers for years. The 18-year-old shoplifter spent years struggling, just constantly reliving the memory of that cell and dreading the dark. The women who explored that abandoned prison spent their entire drive home compulsively checking their rearview mirrors, and Laura still spirals into a total panic at the mere thought of Mike's hand grabbing her arm. And the corrections officer? He hasn't slept well in years. He is basically paralyzed by this constant gnawing fear that Edgar might suddenly show up at his mother's house 1,000 miles away. The physical event ends, yeah, but the psychological chains of the penal system remain wrapped tightly around them.
It really makes you reevaluate everything we think we know about the systems that are meant to manage danger in our society. Whether it's a deeply flawed public record system, an abandoned architectural shell just left to rot, or the totally inexplicable spread of information inside jail walls, these stories prove that just being in proximity to the system carries a massive, hidden cost. Which leaves us with this deeply, deeply unsettling question. If the physical walls of a prison can't actually contain the threat, are you ever truly safe? Thank you so much for hanging out with me today on this explainer. I really hope this provided a clear, if completely terrifying look into these systemic vulnerabilities. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next one.